The morning had started like any other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I flipped pancakes for breakfast, the radio murmuring softly in the background. The routine was comforting, something solid to anchor myself to in a world that always felt a little too chaotic. My wife, Alice, was still asleep upstairs, worn down by her illness. The past few months had blurred into a pattern of caregiving and working from home. It was exhausting, sure, but there was a strange comfort in knowing what each day would bring. As I set the pancakes on a plate and poured syrup over them, I heard the faint ding of a notification from Alice's phone on the kitchen counter. I glanced at it out of habit. Normally, I wouldn't give it a second thought. Her friends and family often sent messages of encouragement, checking on her or offering support. But this message was different. It was a simple line, written by someone named M. "I miss you. Thinking about our nights." The words were innocuous enough, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. I picked up the phone, my pulse quickening. Who was M? What nights? I stared at the message, my hand trembling, the pancakes forgotten. Alice and I had always trusted each other. Her phone wasn't locked, and neither was mine. We had nothing to hide. At least, that's what I'd believed. The message was cryptic, but the insinuation lingered like a dark cloud. I turned the phone over in my hand, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety. Maybe it was a friend, someone she confided in during these difficult times. Maybe it was harmless, a misunderstanding. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Alice's voice broke my thoughts. "James? Are you there?" Her voice was soft and slightly hoarse. I set the phone back on the counter and turned toward the stairs. "Yeah, I'm here," I called, trying to keep my voice even. "Breakfast is ready." She appeared a few moments later, wearing one of her favorite robes, her pale face framed by messy, shoulder-length hair. She smiled weakly at me, the sight both heartwarming and heartbreaking. "Thanks for making breakfast," she said, sitting down at the table. "Of course." I placed the plate in front of her and poured a cup of tea. She smiled again, but I couldn't help noticing how tired she looked, how the illness had stolen pieces of her over the years. We ate in silence, the message still gnawing at the back of my mind. I wanted to ask her about it, but how could I? How could I accuse her of, what, exactly? Something I wasn't even sure of? As she sipped her tea, she glanced at her phone, which I had left screen side down. "Oh, I forgot my phone was down here," she said, picking it up. I held my breath, waiting for her reaction. She flipped it over, saw the message, and for a brief moment, a fraction of a second, her expression shifted. It was subtle, like a flicker of guilt or surprise, but it was there. Then she set the phone down and turned to me, her smile forced. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, changing the subject. "Fine," I replied, though my voice was tighter than I intended. "How about you?" She shrugged. "The usual. Tired. But I think I'll try to do some reading later. It helps pass the time." Her tone was light, casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was deflecting. After breakfast, I cleaned up the dishes while Alice retreated to the living room with her tea and a book. I could hear the soft sound of pages turning as I scrubbed the frying pan, my mind churning. What if I was overreacting? What if M was a friend, a family member, or even a caregiver she confided in during her treatments? But if that were true, why the cryptic nature of the message? Why the flicker of unease on her face? By the time I finished the dishes, I was more confused than ever. I dried my hands, grabbed my laptop, and retreated to my home office under the pretense of work. I couldn't focus, though. The words from the message kept flashing in my mind, like a neon sign in the darkness. "I miss you. Thinking about our nights." The phrasing was too intimate, too personal to ignore. Against my better judgment, I picked up my phone and searched for answers. Who was M? My mind spiraled through possibilities. An old friend? An ex-boyfriend? Someone she'd met at the hospital or during one of her trips before she got sick. And then a more insidious thought crept in. What if the illness hadn't been the only thing she'd hidden from me? The idea made my stomach churn. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the laughter, the arguments, the quiet nights on the couch. Could she have been hiding something all this time? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Alice wasn't like that. She loved me. I was sure of it. But the doubt lingered, persistent and unwelcome. Later that afternoon, I caught myself watching her as she sat by the window, her book resting on her lap. She looked serene, peaceful even, as the sunlight streamed through the curtains. Was it possible I was reading too much into things? Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed again. Alice glanced at it quickly, her expression carefully neutral. Then she picked it up, read the message, and set it down without saying a word. I felt a pang of unease. That night, as we prepared for bed, I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the messages. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words replaying in my mind like a broken record. Who was him? And what secrets was my wife keeping from me? The days after the strange text were a haze of strained normalcy. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the message could have meant anything. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to shove the memory aside, the words loomed like a shadow, dark and persistent. I began to notice things, or perhaps I started looking for things. It was subtle at first. Alice had always been meticulous with her routine. Even as her illness progressed, she clung to certain habits like lifelines. The way she arranged the books on her side table, how she folded the corner of a blanket when she was done with it, or her ritual of preparing a cup of tea before bed. But now, there were changes. One evening, as I tidied up the living room, I found her book, To Kill a Mockingbird, on the coffee table instead of the usual place by her armchair. I picked it up, intending to return it, but the corner of a page caught my eye. Alice never folded pages. She treated her books with reverence. Curious, I flipped to the marked page. A single phrase had been underlined in pencil, the pressure of the stroke heavy enough to indent the page beneath. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. It could have been random, but the weight of it felt deliberate, as if it were speaking directly to me. Was I seeing things because I was looking for them? Alice's voice startled me. Find something interesting? She asked, leaning against the doorway with a faint smile. I snapped the book shut and set it on the table. Just cleaning up, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. She moved toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. You've been quiet lately, she said, her voice soft. Everything okay? Of course. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded. Let me know if you need anything, she said before turning and retreating to the bedroom. The underlined words lingered in my mind, even as I convinced myself they meant nothing. The next day, I came home from a quick trip to the grocery store to find Alice's phone on the kitchen counter, its screen glowing with another notification. My stomach twisted as I saw the sender's name, M. I glanced toward the living room, where Alice was resting. The faint sound of the TV trickled through the house. The temptation was overwhelming. I picked up the phone and unlocked it. My hands trembled as I read the message. Can we talk soon? I miss the sound of your voice. The room felt colder, the air heavier. My thoughts churned, each one more damning than the last. Who was this person? Why was Alice speaking to them? Before I could dig further, Alice's voice called from the living room. James? Are you back? Panicking, I locked the phone and set it down, the motion almost too casual. Yeah, just putting things away, I called back. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, pretending to organize the pantry as I tried to steady my nerves. It was later that evening when the next clue appeared. Alice had gone to bed early, leaving me to clean up the remnants of dinner. As I loaded the dishwasher, I noticed her laptop sitting open on the counter. She rarely used it these days. Her illness had made staring at screens for long periods uncomfortable. I hesitated, my conscience warring with my curiosity. But then I saw it, a tab open on her browser. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. It was an email draft. Dear M, I miss you too. I think about our time together often, especially now. I wish things were different. I wish we... The draft ended abruptly, as though she had been interrupted or changed her mind. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. This wasn't something I could rationalize or dismiss. The message was intimate, unmistakably so. I closed the laptop and leaned against the counter, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. My mind raced. Who was this M? Was it someone from her past? Someone she'd reconnected with recently? And why? Why now? The following morning, I tried to act normal, but the questions gnawed at me like a relentless itch. Alice seemed none the wiser, her demeanor as calm and serene as ever. I decided to test the waters. So, I said over breakfast, I've been thinking we should go through some of our old photos, maybe put together an album or something. She looked up from her plate, her expression neutral. That sounds nice, she said. Do you still have those photos from the conference you went to a few years ago? The one in Chicago? Her hand paused midair, her fork hovering above her plate. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough. I think they're in the attic, she said, her tone measured. Maybe we can dig them out later? Sure, she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. That afternoon, I went to the attic alone, under the pretense of sorting through old boxes. I found the one I was looking for, a small plastic bin labeled Chicago 2018. Inside were neatly organized folders, filled with printed photos, programs, and brochures. I flipped through them quickly, my heart pounding. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Pictures of Alice at the conference, standing with colleagues, attending lectures. But then I found a photo that stopped me cold. It was Alice, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. They were outside a restaurant, their bodies close, their smiles wide. The man's hand rested lightly on her lower back. I flipped the photo over. Someone had written on the back in pen, "Dinner at Marlowe's, what a night." My breath hitched. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his presence was undeniable. Was this him? I searched the rest of the box, but there were no more photos of the man. Still, the evidence was enough to deepen the pit in my stomach. That night, I lay awake beside Alice, unable to sleep. Her breathing was slow and steady, her face peaceful in the dim light. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the clues over and over. The message, the draft email, the photo, they weren't coincidences. They couldn't be. And yet, a small part of me clung to the hope that there was an explanation, a reason that didn't shatter everything we'd built together. But deep down, I knew the truth was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I woke the next morning with a leaden heaviness pressing down on my chest. The memory of the email draft and the photo burned in my mind, refusing to fade no matter how much I tried to distract myself. Alice was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea. She looked up and smiled when I walked in, a soft, unassuming gesture that twisted something deep inside me. How could she smile like that, so freely, while I felt like I was suffocating? As I poured my coffee, I considered confronting her. The words balanced on the edge of my tongue, ready to tumble out, but I hesitated. What would I even say? Hey, Alice, who's him? It sounded ridiculous in my head. Worse, what if I was wrong? I couldn't shake the gnawing thought that I might blow up our lives over nothing, over a misunderstanding or coincidence. Sleep okay? Alice asked, her voice light but tinged with concern. Not really, I replied, not meeting her gaze. Just a lot on my mind. Anything you want to talk about? Her offer sounded sincere, and for a moment, I was tempted. But instead, I shook my head. No, just work stuff. She nodded, sipping her tea. Well, let me know if I can help. Her kindness was like a knife in my gut. I needed perspective, someone to talk to who wouldn't jump to conclusions or judge me. So, later that afternoon, I called my best friend, Chris. He had been my rock through countless storms, the kind of friend who knew when to listen and when to challenge me. We met at a small diner, the kind with peeling vinyl booths and sticky tabletops. Chris was already there when I arrived, nursing a cup of coffee and scrolling through his phone. Hey man, he said, standing to clap me on the shoulder. You look like hell. Thanks, I muttered, sliding into the booth across from him. He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. What's going on? I hesitated, then launched into everything, the text message, the email draft, the photo. I didn't leave anything out, not even my own doubts about whether I was reading too much into it. Chris listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing as I spoke. When I finished, he let out a long breath. Okay, he said. First off, I don't think you're crazy. That stuff would make anyone suspicious. I nodded, relief washing over me. But, he continued, you don't have the whole picture yet. You need more than a few weird texts and a photo before you confront her. Otherwise, you're just gonna push her away. So what do? I asked, my voice edged with frustration. Chris leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Keep your eyes open. Look for more pieces of the puzzle. And, if it comes down to it, ask her directly. But don't go in guns blazing. If you're wrong, you'll regret it. It wasn't the definitive answer I'd hoped for, but it was sound advice. That night, I tried to follow Chris's guidance. I paid closer attention to Alice, to her words and actions. Was she more guarded than usual? Did her smile linger a second too long? Or was that my imagination? I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, paranoid, suspicious, doubting every little thing. And yet, I couldn't stop. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. The next morning, as I returned from the grocery store, I found Alice sitting in the living room with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried an air of quiet confidence. My heart slammed against my ribs. Hey, Alice said, her voice cheerful but slightly hesitant. James, this is Michael. He's a friend from before we moved here. Michael. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my expression neutral. Nice to meet you, I said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his smile polite but reserved. You too, he replied. What brings you to town? I asked, forcing casualness into my tone. Oh, I was just passing through and thought I'd stop by to catch up, Michael said smoothly. Alice nodded. He reached out last week, and I thought it'd be nice to see him again. My mind reeled. She hadn't mentioned this to me, not once. I see, I said, sitting down across from them. How do you two know each other? We worked together for a while, Michael said, his tone measured. A long time ago. The conversation continued, polite and unremarkable, but my thoughts were a storm of questions. Why hadn't Alice told me about him? Was this the same Michael from the email and the texts? When Michael finally left, Alice turned to me, her expression unreadable. What did you think? She asked. I hesitated, then decided to test the waters. Seemed nice enough. Kind of unexpected, though. She tilted her head. Unexpected? Well, you never mentioned him before, I said, keeping my tone light. Alice shrugged. It didn't seem important. He was just a colleague. And with everything going on lately, I thought it'd be nice to catch up with someone from before. All this? Her explanation was reasonable, even plausible. But it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. That night, as Alice slept, I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind. Something about Michael's demeanor felt off, too polished, too practiced. I remembered Chris's advice, to keep my eyes open, to look for more pieces of the puzzle. And now, I had a new piece. I needed to know more about Michael. The next day, while Alice napped, I searched his name online. It didn't take long to find his social media profiles and a LinkedIn page. He was exactly who he said he was, a former colleague, now working in another state. But there were no mentions of Alice, no photos, nothing to suggest a deeper connection. Frustrated, I dug deeper, combing through old conference records and company rosters. Finally, I found a photo from a corporate event years ago. There they were, Alice and Michael, standing side by side, their smiles wide. But it wasn't their proximity that caught my attention. It was the way his hand rested lightly on her back, the same way it had in the photo I'd found in the attic. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. As I stared at the screen, a new realization hit me. I didn't just suspect anymore. I knew. But knowing didn't make it easier. It only made the weight of uncertainty harder to bear. The day after Michael's visit, I decided enough was enough. The weight of uncertainty had grown unbearable, every moment feeling like a tug-of-war between paranoia and rationality. If I wanted peace, I had to find answers. The first step was simple but invasive. I waited until Alice was showering and took her phone. My heart raced as I scrolled through her messages, half expecting to find damning evidence that would rip my world apart. To my surprise, the thread with M was clean. Only a handful of polite exchanges about his visit. There was nothing intimate, nothing resembling the texts I had seen earlier. It was almost too perfect. My gut told me something wasn't right. That afternoon, I followed another thread of curiosity, the old email draft I had found on her laptop. While Alice napped, I booted up her computer and scoured her sent folder, hoping to find the full message. It wasn't there. Frustrated, I checked her drafts folder, but it was empty. Had she deleted it after I found it? Or had it been a placeholder for something else? I opened the browser history next. Alice wasn't particularly tech-savvy, and I hoped she hadn't thought to clear it. Sure enough, there was a trail, searches for hotels, flights, even jewelry stores. Most of it was innocuous, tied to her past trips or gifts she had purchased for me. But one entry made my stomach drop, a search for hidden messaging apps. My chest tightened as I clicked the link, which led to an article outlining the best apps for keeping private conversations hidden. The article itself was unremarkable, but its existence on her computer felt like confirmation of something darker. That evening, I tried to act normal. I made dinner, joked with Alice about a rerun of her favorite show, and helped her to bed without letting on how tightly wounded I felt. Once she was asleep, I took another step toward finding the truth, hiring a private investigator. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I needed someone who could dig deeper than I could without raising Alice's suspicions. The investigator, a gruff but sharp man named Carter, listened patiently as I explained the situation. When I mentioned Michael, Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you have a photo of him?" he asked. I handed him the printout from the conference records. Carter nodded, pocketing the picture. "I'll see what I can find. Give me a few days." The following morning, I decided to confront Alice, not directly, but in a way that would test her reaction. Over breakfast, I casually brought up Michael. "So, did you enjoy catching up with Michael?" I asked, sipping my coffee. Alice looked up from her tea, her expression unreadable. "It was nice," she said. "He's doing well, which is good to see. Do you think you'll stay in touch?" She shrugged. "Maybe. Why?" "Just curious," I said, keeping my tone light. "You never mentioned him before. I figured you must have been close." Alice hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We worked together for a while. That's all." Her response felt rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this line of questioning. 2 days later, Carter called. "Got something for you," he said, his tone brisk. We met at his office, a small, cluttered space that smelled faintly of stale coffee. Carter handed me a file containing photos and notes. "Your guy, Michael," he began. "He's married. Lives about 2 hours from here. Has 2 kids." I stared at the photos, which showed Michael with a woman and 2 young children, smiling in front of their home. "He doesn't seem like someone who's hiding an affair," Carter continued. "But there's one thing that stood out. He travels a lot, business trips, mostly. And one of those trips overlaps with a hotel booking your wife made last year." The air seemed to leave the room. "Are you sure?" I asked. Carter nodded. "It's not conclusive, but it's a hell of a coincidence." I left his office with the file, my mind racing. If Michael was married, why would Alice entertain him? And why would they book the same hotel? That evening, I decided to confront her directly. After dinner, I sat across from her in the living room, the file resting on the coffee table between us. "Alice," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her expression wary. "What is it? Are you hiding something from me?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Why would you think that?" I hesitated, then slid the file toward her. "Michael, the hotel? I want to know the truth." Alice stared at the file for a long moment, her face pale. Then she sighed and leaned back against the couch. "I should have told you," she said quietly. "Told me what?" "Michael and we were close, but not in the way you think." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Alice hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "After my diagnosis, I reached out to a lot of old friends. I was scared, James. I needed support, and Michael, he was there for me." "Support?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Not like that," she insisted. "We talked, that's all. He understood what I was going through." "And the hotel?" She winced. "That was a mistake. I asked him to meet me because I needed someone to talk to in person, but nothing happened. I swear. Her explanation felt genuine, and yet, something about it didn't sit right. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. I didn't want you to worry, she said, tears welling in her eyes. You've been so good to me, and I didn't want to burden you with my fears. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words at face value and put this whole mess behind us. But as I looked into her eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That night, as Alice slept, I reviewed the file again. Carter's notes about the hotel booking gnawed at me, especially the overlapping dates. Then I noticed something I'd missed before, a receipt tucked in the back of the folder. It was from a local jewelry store, dated 3 months ago, for a purchase of 2 identical gold bands. My blood ran cold. Why would Alice buy 2 rings? And who was the second one for? The receipt for the gold bands stayed in my hand all night, its edges curling slightly from the sweat of my fingers. I turned it over and over, willing it to make sense. The jewelry store was local, one I'd driven past countless times. The date on the receipt was clear, but the purpose was maddeningly absent. Why 2 bands? The question burned through me, casting doubt on everything I thought I knew. Alice's explanations about Michael felt thin now, stretched to the breaking point. Was he the one she bought the rings for? Were they symbols of something deeper, something I couldn't bear to name? By morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I needed answers, no matter the cost. Alice was in the kitchen when I found her, sipping tea and gazing out the window. She looked serene, but I knew better. Can we talk? I asked, setting the receipt on the counter in front of her. Her brow furrowed as she picked it up. Then her face paled. Where did you find this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That doesn't matter, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. I need to know what this is about. Alice set the receipt down carefully, her hands trembling. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the countertop. I was going to tell you, she said finally. When? I don't know. She exhaled shakily, tears pooling in her eyes. James, it's not what you think. Then tell me, I said, my voice cracking, because all I've got are questions, and I'm done guessing. She nodded, wiping her eyes. The rings, they weren't for Michael. They were for us. I blinked. What? I bought them after my last doctor's appointment, she said, her voice trembling. I'd been thinking a lot about us, about everything you've done for me, and I wanted to renew our vows. Her words hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. You wanted to renew our vows? I repeated, barely able to process it. Yes, she said, her tears falling freely now. I wanted to surprise you, to show you how much you mean to me. But then I got scared. I kept thinking about all the ways I failed you, all the things I should have told you. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Alice, I said, my own voice trembling. What things? What haven't you told me? She looked up, her eyes red and raw. Michael, she said, her voice barely audible. My stomach clenched. It wasn't an affair, she said quickly, as though reading my mind. But I wasn't honest with you either. When I was first diagnosed, I felt so lost. Michael was someone I could talk to without fear of judgment. He made me feel normal. Her words felt like knives, each one twisting deeper. I didn't mean to keep it from you, she continued. But then it got complicated. He started saying things about how he still cared for me, about how he wished he'd done things differently when we worked together. I should have cut it off, but I didn't. Why? I asked, my voice tight. Because I was scared, she admitted. Scared of how much I'd come to depend on him. Scared that if I told you, you'd think I didn't love you anymore. Did you? Her eyes widened. James, of course I love you. I've always loved you. Michael was a mistake, one I regret more than anything. Her confession left me reeling. I wanted to believe her, to take her at her word. But the cracks in my trust were too deep. And the hotel? I asked. Why meet him there? Her face crumpled. Because I needed to end it. He'd been pushing for more, and I knew I couldn't let it continue. So I told him goodbye, and I haven't spoken to him since. I searched her eyes for any hint of deceit, but all I saw was raw, unfiltered pain. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice breaking. Because I was ashamed, she said. Ashamed of how weak I'd been, of how much I'd hurt you without even meaning to. And then, when I bought the rings, I thought maybe I could fix it. But I waited too long. Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. We spent the next few hours in silence, each of us retreating to our own corners of the house. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my mind, turning her words over and over like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to believe that her intentions had been pure, that Michael had been nothing more than a fleeting lapse in judgment. But trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. That evening, I got a call from Carter. I ran into something you might want to know about, he said, his tone grim. What is it? Michael's been lying to you. He's not just a former colleague. He's someone Alice dated before she met you. The ground seemed to shift beneath me. She didn't mention that, I said, my voice tight. I figured, Carter said. There's more. Michael's been telling people that Alice reached out to him first, that she said she wanted to see him because she wasn't happy at home. Rage coursed through me. Do you have proof? I asked. I've got witnesses, Carter said, and a few texts he sent bragging about it. Want me to send them over? I hesitated, then said, yes. When I confronted Alice with Carter's findings, her reaction was immediate and visceral. He's lying, she said, her voice shaking with anger. I never said that. I never felt that. James, you have to believe me. But I didn't know what to believe anymore. The next few days were a blur of raw emotions and difficult conversations. Alice insisted that Michael was manipulating the situation to cover his own tracks, while I struggled to separate fact from fiction. In the end, the truth was murky, a tangled web of half-truths, missteps, and broken trust. Alice and I agreed to take a break, to give ourselves time to process everything. She moved in with her sister, leaving the house eerily quiet. I spent those weeks reflecting, trying to untangle the mess of emotions inside me. Love, anger, betrayal, they all coexisted, refusing to be neatly categorized. The last time I saw Alice, it was at the park where we'd first met. She handed me the rings she'd bought, her eyes filled with tears. I still want this, she said, her voice trembling. But only if you do too. I stared at the rings, their weight heavy in my palm. I don't know if I can, I said honestly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. As she walked away, I felt the weight of the decision I'd made, and the life we'd lost. That night, I placed the rings in a drawer, unsure if I'd ever take them out again. Some truths are too complex to untangle, too painful to resolve. But as I sat in the quiet of the house, I realized that this, too, was a kind of ending, and perhaps, in time, a beginning.